If you want to keep your watercolors fresh and vibrant, there are several things you can do to improve your results, and in this video I will tell you exactly how I achieve vivid, intense colors, because this question comes up over and over in my comments and I know you guys want to see how I do it. I'm going to use this rose as an example to explain how these methods work, from the brands and pigments that give you the most vibrant look to specific techniques I use. And you can download my reference photo in the video description below. I also saved the full list of materials in the description below, so let's get started. Tip number 1, instead of mixing your pigments on the palette, try mixing them on paper wet on wet. So this is what I'm doing here in the first layer on our rose, and 9 times out of 10 you will see me paint a light layer of my base color, and then as it's drying out I'm adding other pigments into it. So cooler colors in the area of shadow and warmer colors in the area of light. Essentially, I'm not giving my pigments too much opportunity to mute or overpower one another, as it often happens if you mix on the palette first. Instead, as you see here, every new pigment I use stays more or less concentrated where I put it down with my brush, and then gently spreads in other areas. So you end up with larger areas of concentrated pigment rather than a more muted mixture. This wet and wet technique is a bit tricky at first, but as long as you have good cotton paper and experiment with the amount of water and drying time, you will get a hang of it. Naturally, it won't work with every pigment, and non-granulating pigments work a lot better, but more on that later. So here I use quinacridone rose from Daniel Smith with some quinacridone magenta on the first wash all over the petals, and while it is still wet, I'm quickly adding quinacridone coral in the center where I want more warmth, and quinacridone violet towards the edges in the areas where petals have some shadow. Violet is closer to blue on the spectrum, and the closer we get to our cold blues, the more distant and dark the area will appear, which is exactly what we need for our shadows here. So immediately I'm sort of establishing soft boundaries of each petal and map where my next layers of color are going to go. Now let's let this layer dry completely and move on to the next layer and tip number 2. So quinacridone family of colors offer us a great combination of vibrancy and transparency, making them a perfect choice for building super vibrant layers. So you may have noticed when I just listed the first 4 pigments that I used on the flower, they all come from a quinacridone family. It's not an accident. If you ever used quinacridones, you know that they're very intense but also transparent. And this unique combination of vibrancy and transparency is what makes them perfect for painting really vivid, juicy layers, building the intensity slowly while preserving the luminosity in your work. They also tend to retain their vibrancy and brilliance when drying, because you may have noticed a lot of times the vibrancy goes away as your water dries out, and you're left with a fairly dull color you may not have expected while you were painting. So quinacridones tend to preserve their vibrancy while drying, and they're your best bet if you're going for super strong color. And I tend to stay away from highly granulating colors with some exceptions. That is not to say that they're bad or anything, it's just that they interfere with the glazing technique, with all this layering that I do, which is one of my favorite techniques, and I will talk to you about glazing in just a moment. But first, tip number 3. And this may be a bit controversial, but I will tell you because it does play a role in my work. Basically, I don't shy away from fugitive fluorescent opera pink, and you can see me starting to add it slowly here on the petals. This pigment can be found in most watercolor brand sets, and it's the most vivid pink you can find in any watercolor range, and you can see it adds crazy intensity to botanicals. I wouldn't use it on skin personally because it's too unnatural if you're painting skin tones, and it's also a bit granulating, but for flowers it's absolutely amazing. Now, it is highly fugitive, meaning it will fade if you leave it in direct sunlight, and that doesn't mean it's going to fade in days or weeks or even months, but after a few years it will definitely start losing vibrancy. And I don't mind using this pigment in my professional work that ends up digitized. like silver coins that feature my watercolors or surface design, because it's just so beautiful, and once it's digital, it will never fade. However, if you're painting something that you plan to sell, to be hanging on a wall, and you have no control over how it's going to be framed, whether your buyer will put it under UV glass, you may want to skip it and consider a light, fast, non-fugitive color. This is a great pigment if you want to add a bit of pop to your florals, and as an accent it is really, really great, but do consider the light fastness aspect. Tip number 4, I wanted to mention specific brands I use and love because of their vibrancy. I did several videos on my favorite ones, which I will leave in the video description below, but essentially I use a lot of core watercolors by Golden, specifically for my quinacridones, and the reason is core pigments use a different binder called Aquazol. Without getting too technical, this binder can hold much greater amounts of pigment, so you get a really good color strength as a result. Aquazol was first used by professionals in the field of fine art conservation as an adhesive and in painting medium, and then Golden, which is the company that develops core watercolors, started using it as a binder for watercolor paint to replace traditional gum arabic. So I've been using core pretty much from day one when they came out with their range, and I was lucky enough to be offered a small sample in my local art store, and I actually credit them with getting me excited about watercolors years ago, because I generally favor more vibrant colors. And until then, I was very much focused on gouache, but core watercolor range really got me excited about vibrant botanicals and using watercolors in my commercial work. Tip number 5, let's leave chemistry for a second and quickly talk about our water, and I'll share a really easy tip that doesn't cost anything. If you ever notice your colors get a bit muddy, try using 2 jars of water instead of 1. So the first one will be to clean your brush, and the second one to give it another bath and really make sure you get rid of your color before switching to the next one. You may not realize it, but pigments really do tend to get in and stay in the base of the brush where the hairs are entering the ferrule, this part where the metal is. And if you ever switched from, say, blue to yellow without cleaning your brush thoroughly, you know it will make your colors muddy immediately. That's the last thing you want when working with light layers, because we can't erase when painting with watercolor. So if you do get a bit of a cross-contamination this way, use 2 jars of water and it will keep your colors fresh. If you're interested in learning more in depth about how to clean and condition your brushes so they can stay clean and last longer, I have a video on that, and I will leave the link in the video description below and in the card above. Tip number 6, glazing. I have an entire video on the glazing technique, which is not surprisingly the most watched video on my channel, but essentially glazing is a technique you're seeing here on this rose, and it involves building transparent layers of pigment to change values and the color appearance in your final painting, creating deeper tones and more saturated color areas. So in other words, it's layering your pigments to build strength slowly, and while you're doing it, the areas you cover get progressively smaller and smaller, and your pigments get more and more saturated. What I like about this technique is that it allows me to keep entire areas dedicated to unique color. So whether it's a warm, juicy highlight like I used here with quinacridone coral, indicating some warm sunlight maybe, to cooler pinks that really pop, and also some purples here in the shadows, I'm glazing them in sections, focusing on very small areas on each petal, and I'm not mixing them at all. So the final result is areas of pure vibrant color throughout, and it's all being held together by the initial background layer that we painted in the beginning. Lastly, let's talk about contrast and color theory. You can't quite see it on this rose, but you will probably see it more clearly on this little kangaroo on the left. So essentially, using complementary colors, and you can find them on the color wheel, like this orange and blue opposite of each other, leads to increased intensity as our eyes read them together side by side. So when you use colors from the opposite side of the spectrum, they literally boost each other, and this may or may not be the result you're after, but it works every time. Here's a better example from another painting I'm working on. I'm pairing warm juicy corals and reds with warm greens. It's a bit of an overload, certainly not a natural look, but I'm not about having a natural look here. So what I want is to highlight the beauty of this rose and really make it pop. So if I wanted something a bit more natural, I would go with a different color scheme. So that's it. Our rose is done and I can move on to the kangaroo. I hope you enjoyed these tips. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you next week with a new video.